I'll watch gazillions of people.
3, 4, 5. Oh, there it goes. All right. Let me share my screen. Okay. Oh, now it shows up at the top. Oh, I have to go to, I see. Got it. I have to actually move above screen sharing and it will come up. So.
Okay, so you see it now?
Yeah.
Good. Okay. Welcome. I see that people are entering the webinar. It is 4:58, so we're going to wait a couple minutes before Debbie begins. But I'm glad you're all here, and it should be a great talk. I've seen Debbie's images, and they're beautiful. For those of you who are coming in now, I wanted to mention that next Wednesday, Jay Vivian is going to be doing a history walk at Cornhill. Because of COVID, we're limiting it to 10 participants. We'll be repeating it again on Wednesday, September 3rd. So those of you who can't get in next Wednesday will have a chance to sign up for the September history walk. But so far, I've only had 4 people sign up. So I've got 6 spaces. So shoot me an email, director at TroHistoricalSociety.org if you're interested in Jay's talk. It's going to be at 10 o'clock a week from today. Okay. And we're at 4:59. We've got 18 people here. We'll give it another minute or two before we begin. Debbie, where exactly is that picture that we're looking at?
That's probably on one of the fire roads off of Collins, just where I go running and hiking quite a bit. I'm guessing that's where the picture is taken.
Pretty.
Basic Cape Fear forest.
Did you take that shot this spring?
I did not. This shot is probably last summer.
Really pretty. All right, it's 5:01. And we have 19 attendees here, so I think we're going to get started. Welcome, everyone. I'm happy that you're here for Debbie Merriam's talk this afternoon. Just to briefly introduce Debbie, she is the Arboretum Director at the Mary Wakefield Arboretum in Milton, Massachusetts. The Arboretum is an organization that offers educational programs on ecology, horticulture, agriculture, and historic preservation. Debbie has a master's degree in historic preservation, focusing on cultural landscape, and she has a master's degree from the Yale School of Forestry in environmental management. And you'll be pleased to hear that she has been exploring the ecosystems and history of Truro for 15 years, so she is very well qualified to share what she's learned about Truro with us today. A couple of logistics before Debbie gets started. Feel free to use the Q&A at the bottom of your screen to type in questions. I'll be monitoring those throughout. And when Debbie is finished, I'll be presenting your questions to her. We're planning for Debbie to talk for around 45 minutes, and then we'll reserve the last 15 for your questions. This is being recorded, so if you need to leave early, no problem. You can catch it on our website. We'll be putting a link to it on our website in the next day or so. Also, just another reminder, next Wednesday, Jay Vivian will be giving a history walking tour of Cornhill at 10 o'clock in the morning. Because of COVID, we're limiting it to 10 people. I've only had 4 people register. So if you're interested, shoot me an email, director@TroHistoricalSociety.org. So I am going to mute my microphone and stop my camera and give this over to Debbie. So enjoy the talk.
Thank you very much, Lauren. So welcome everybody. This is kind of a funny thing to give a talk and not see people in the class, but I'm gonna give it a shot. And Lauren mentioned that I work in Milton, Massachusetts, and I spend a lot of time in Truro. And what's really interesting is the plant communities in Truro versus the plant communities in Milton. And that has a lot to do with the very different geology of those sites. As we know, Cape Cod is incredibly sandy, and it has a very thin layer of topsoil. And what I notice about Milton is the soil is much more complex. So the plant communities there are much more complex. So I'm going to start my talk. Oops. Okay. So the three things that I'm really going to focus on are the fact that there has been a major climate change in New England over the last 13,000 years, and that has to do with the retreat of the Laurentide ice sheet. And then the second most important one is the arrival of the Europeans on Cape Cod. And then finally, what's happening now and the current rapid climate change that we are experiencing. So the Cape Cod has changed 13,000 years ago. That Long Island Sound didn't exist, and animals roamed over large landmass of grasslands and forests that included Cape Cod and extended south to Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket. So simple grasslands and pine forests. And then 8,000 years ago, the grasslands and the forest evolved into a mix of pitch pine and oak, which is similar to what we have now. And Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket were separated from the Cape and became islands. And then 6,000 years ago, as the ice sheet continued to retreat, the rising sea covered the lowlands and eroded glacial sands and formed saltwater bays, estuaries, salt marshes, and beaches. And the shape of and composition of the Cape is what we know today, began to form. So the first part of my talk really focuses on Native American land use and their history on Cape Cod. And their history here has been, they've been on Cape Cod for more than almost 12,000 years. And how do we know that information? We're going to look at pollen analysis, some carbon dating, archaeology, Wampanoag traditions and written documents, and documentation by Europeans. And I just want to mention that I don't use documentation by Europeans too much in this talk, because I feel that a lot of the Europeans that came to the Cape had a very subjective attitude when they looked at the Wampanoag people. And that had to do with their inexperience of what the Native Americans were doing with the land. And they were implying their own information about what that looked like. So it's very subjective, and I try to stay away from that and use these other ways of gathering information to find out what happened here over the last 12,000 years. So the first thing is pollen analysis, and this has a lot to do with the fact that a lot of Truro and the Outer Cape is part of the National Park System, so there's a lot of research that happens here. And this happens in the ponds, and specifically Round Pond. And what happens is they take a core of the sediment in the ponds, and what happens over time, sediments, all plant pollen sinks to the bottom of the ponds, and it collects, and it's preserved in the pond water, which is kind of cool to think about. And then so they can take these cores that look like this, and then they can analyze what kind of plant material is in each slice of the core. And through this process, they've been able to figure out what plant communities have evolved over time. And one of the earliest ones is a tundra plant, which was collected from a layer in the pond, and it was dated to be 12,000 years old. And the fact that this was a plant that normally grows in a place that's very, very cold tells us that it was much colder here than it is today. about 12,000 years ago. The other thing that existed on Cape Cod, and this is actually, some of you may recognize this shot. This is out by the old Coast Guard station, which is now the youth hostel by Ballston Beach. And this is heath and heather vegetation area. And this was a very important component of the vegetation since the last ice age. And it was the first thing that colonized after the glacial retreat 15,000 years ago. And then it was followed by pine and oak trees and eventually hardwood forests that were inhabited by the Wampanoags. So it's very interesting that now these are the plant communities that exist on Cape Cod. And I'm going to go into why that is and how these communities are here now and where we're headed going forward. So with the pollen analysis, what it shows us is they've been able to go back about 2,500 years and look at what kind of plants were growing in Truro. And not only what kind of plants were growing, but how often there was amount of burning happening. And I'm going to talk about quite a bit about burning and how Native Americans used fire in their farming and hunting practices. What it what these pollen analysis tells us is that hardwood species diversity in the forests of Truro was much more prevalent. So now when we walk around the forest in Truro, it looks very similar to that first slide I show. It's mostly oak, scrub oak, and pitch pine. Otherwise, once in a while, you might see sassafras or beech, but there's not a lot of other species prevalent in Truro. But so previous to European settlement, there was a lot more diversity. So there was pine, there's even some sugar maple. There was hickory, which was quite common. And there was beech, and this is actually a picture of beech forest, a little blurry, but we still have a beech forest in Provincetown. And then there was even some birch and gray birch and silver birch that existed here in Truro. So it's interesting to think about that these hardwood species that we very rarely see were very prevalent about 2,500 years ago on Cape Cod, along with the pitch pine and the oak that we see today. Also hemlock trees, which we don't see very rarely on Cape Cod, were prevalent as well. So the next thing that we know, because we know about the history of the last 12,000 years, is because of the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe. And the Wampanoag tribe was also known as the people of the first light, and they have inhabited Massachusetts for 12,000 years. The Wampanoag live with a close spiritual connection to the land, and that they believe the Creator made their people out of the earth and the trees with whom they shared the breath of life. And this is, I feel like it's very important to understand this concept, because the Wampanoag lived here for 12,000 years, and they managed to protect and live within the ecosystem without changing it very much. So that's an incredibly longevity time to have that amazing connection to the land. And these Wampanoag are making the traditional mishoon, the boat, and it's made out of a very large tree. And sometimes it would have been hickory or chestnut, and neither of those species are around, no chestnut trees. But this is, they burn the inside slowly to create the passenger area for the boat. And I want to talk a little bit about the Wampanoag Language Reclamation Project, because the reality is that they have a very rich language that has been lost for 150 years. And that was due to colonization and making the Native Americans speak English and trying to reject their language over a long period of time. And why this is important is that there are many, many written documents about the history of the Wampanoag on Cape Cod that are now being able, that now that the language is being brought back, people are able to read these documents and interpret what they said. And that information will be crucial going forward to understand their long history here on Cape Cod. So it's a really interesting project. I highly recommend you take a look at their website. So the Wampanoag we know were farmers and hunters and fishermen all at the same time. And we know that they planted the Three Sisters, and the reason they did that was that the corn offered the beans necessary support, and pole beans would pull nitrogen out of the air and bring it to the soil for the benefit of all three. And then the large leaves of the squash could protect all three from and keep the soil shaded and keep weeds out. So this is a very important food source for Cape Cod Native Americans. And this is what made it different for people in the southern New England versus Native Americans in northern New England, say Maine, because they didn't have quite the long season to farm. They were much more restricted by what they could eat. So the Native Americans on Cape Cod had a much better and varied diet, and it allowed their population to grow much faster than Native Americans in the northern part of New England. I think that's a very fascinating thing, and it all had to do with the fact that they could keep food and have a variety of food sources beyond meat and fish. And I just wanted to point out that if you want to see the Three Sisters Garden, there's one at the Cobb Library, and it's doing incredibly well. It's really fantastic. And so if you want to take a look at it, just go up to the Cobb and you'll see it right on the hill in front of, on the side of the building. So the other thing that is interesting about the Three Sisters is that when they planted the corn when scrub oak was the size of a mouse's ear. And I think that it's just a lovely little story of how you would decide when to plant your corn. It had to do with what time in the season. So here's just low bush blueberries, which were an important food source for Native Americans. And we see them on Cape Cod, and the scrub oak as well. Provided lots of protein with the acorns. Another plant that was used by Wampanoag is sassafras, and I mentioned this earlier. You do see sassafras around. It was the bark was used as well as the leaves for medicinal purposes, and it was also used to make some tools out of as well. Now we know that the Wampanoag lived in shelters that are called Witu, and they are dome-shaped traditional home. And what's interesting is some of them were made out of big sheets of bark, like the one on the left, and they were used cedar saplings that were bent in a shape, and then the bark was laid over them, or they were made out of reeds. And it had to do with the seasonality of the buildings. If it was a colder, for the winter time, they would more likely use the bark and the heavier materials. And in the summertime, they would use the lightweight materials. And what's really great about these buildings is that they were easy to move. So when the Wampanoag had to move to different territories on the Cape, they could easily disassemble their homes and move them to other areas. So two plants that were really important in making these were cattails and bulrush. And they were collected by the women and woven into mats. And each of them, the bulrush was often painted in bright colors and put on the inside, and it provided warmth, and then the cattails provided protection from rain and wind. Another plant that, this is actually, I love this plant, it's incredibly beautiful, but people associate it as poison sumac. It's not poisonous, and the Wampanoag use this to make a very high vitamin C kind of lemonade, and they still drink it today. And I have made it. I would recommend doing it. It's really tastes quite delicious, and it's very good for you. Also, beach plums were used by Native Americans as a food source, and what has become very important about beach plum today is that it keeps the dunes from eroding. So it's a very important plant, both as a food source, but also to protect Cape Cod from erosion. And another one is the beach goldenrod, which is a beautiful plant, and Native Americans use this for the yellow color for making dye. And then of course the classic pitch pine, which was used for everything from curing rheumatism to using the tar, the pitch for lighting, making lanterns, and for keeping things waterproof. So I mentioned I want to talk a little bit about Native Americans using burning. And this was an important part of their lives on Cape Cod. They would burn part of the wood so it would be easier to travel, and they would be able to see their prey more easily. But what is most neglected in understanding the use of periodic burns by Native Americans is it added and enriched the soil by occasionally burning it. And this is an issue with Cape Cod. We know that over time, the majority of Cape Cod is basically sand, and there's very little organic matter on top of that sand, and all plants are very dependent on that organic matter. So once that organic matter has been removed, you're basically dealing with sand, and you'll see a little further on into the slideshow what I'm talking about. But this was a very important long-term management system by the Native Americans to make sure that the soil retained its organic matter. And I think this is often overlooked in understanding the use of fire on Cape Cod. Now, one of the reasons we can figure out how often fires occurred is tree ring analysis. And what they do is you stick this little dial in, it's a little drill on the right into the tree, and it shows us each year of growth of the tree. So you can see if there's been a forest fire, you can see the scar from the fire. If there's a dry season, the rings are very close together. And if it's rainy, the tree puts on a lot more growth. So the tree ring analysis can tell you a lot about trees. And then as a result, it can tell you a lot about the forest where that tree was cored. The other thing that's happening is up by the old, I don't know what it is. It's the old station off of Collins Road up on the hill. There's been a lot of experimental burns being done by the Cape Cod National Forest. And it's very interesting to see the difference. So here's the woods with you can see it's very dense where there hasn't been a burn. And then in this photo, you can see this burn was done 2 years ago. So the understory is just starting to come back. But this is a traditional Native American practice. And here it is today being used by the national park to try to understand how plant communities benefit from fire as opposed to not letting them burn for many, many years. So the other thing that happened when the Native Americans burned is they created what's called the edge effect. So you had wooded areas, but then you also had areas on the edge that were more open and sunny. So this was a good place to go hunting because the animals would go into the woods for protection, but they would also like to easily pass through these open areas. And this whole area of edge effect became increasingly important for Native Americans in their ability to hunt animals, but also the edge effect by burning created these areas where you could have a great selection of fruits, maybe strawberries and wild blueberries and blackberries would grow in these open areas. And these were also important food sources for the Wampanoags. And here's some examples of those. And I see this today on Cape Cod, where areas where there's been a lot of clearing, all of a sudden we see a lot more of the native fruits returning, especially blackberries. And I think it's blackberry season right now. Unfortunately, blueberries this year have been a little sparse, in my opinion. If anybody has seen a good area, then you can let me know. So this is called when the edge effect and how the Native Americans were living on Cape for thousands and thousands of years. They were creating what's called mosaics. And these mosaics are many different forests at many different levels of succession or growth. And this is very healthy for a large ecosystem to have plants that are at different levels of growth throughout an area. And you have trees that are very old and large. So you could go into those forests and get your bark for your home, or you could cut larger trees from that area to make your mishoon. Whereas if you had smaller trees, that was probably a better area for hunting and for places for small game would go. And then where you had completely open, that was where you could do some of your farming and your collection of fruits. So this was a systematic approach that was used by Native Americans. How that was understood, it's not really clear, but I think it's a really interesting way to look at ecology, and this is a model that's being used to go forward in many places all over the world today. So I mentioned that Cape Cod soil has a very, very thin layer of organic material, and that Native Americans were managing the soil by burning and their farming techniques. And this led to the very balanced ecosystem for thousands and thousands of years. And this is a picture of the soil. And you can see the first foot or even 6 inches is the dark organic matter, and then it's just basically sand below that. So they were dealing with very poor soil, but managed to live very well for thousands and thousands of years here on Cape Cod. And then the next phase is European settlement. So we know that the Pilgrims arrived, and we're about the 400th anniversary of their arrival in Truro, and things began to change rather quickly. And this is because they had a different view of the land and coming here. We know that they were coming here for religious persecution, but also to look for new supplies, and because a lot of Europe had been completely denuded and a lot of the ecological important items there had been used up. So coming to the United States was a huge boon, and there was so much to see and to use here that it quickly became clear that it was commodification, and that a lot of these things would be used to help their survival and also sent back to Europe. So we know that shipbuilding was very popular here. There was a lot of, it's hard to imagine today, but the Pamet Harbor was home to many, many shipbuilding facilities. So a lot of the wood was used to build ships. And then almost immediately, farming was begun, but most importantly, the largest difference between Native American land use and the European land and arrival and colonization was keeping livestock and keeping animals. And by doing that, it really had a huge impact on the land. So grazing, here's a great old postcard of grazing up at Highland Light. You can see that fences had been put in, and keeping cattle and sheep happened very quickly. Here's some pictures. So there was a lot of, it's another thing that's amazing to think about, is that there were a lot of sheep and cattle on Cape Cod. And here's the figures that show at some point in between 1775 and 1825, there were 17,000 sheep on Cape Cod. That's a lot of sheep, I think. And then more than 6,000 cattle as well. So that was a lot of livestock being kept in a landscape that, as I mentioned, did not have a very good organic layer. And so this was going to have a huge impact on the ecosystems of Truro. Another thing that was happening was collecting cranberries. And in the lower right, you can see the beginning of what happened was Cape Cod that was completely covered with, completely forested with the forest mosaics that the Native Americans made, was quickly becoming completely denuded of all trees. And here you can see is a great old postcard of Pond Village of Cape Cod, but there's nary a tree in sight, and everything is made out of wood, of course. And then here's one a little later in the same. There's very, very few trees. You can see all the way across, and the church steeples in the distance. And this is, I love this because it says where they cut ice out of the pond in Pond Village. And then this is what happened. The part of the dunes had always existed from as the glacier receded, but as the trees were removed, the sands became much more, the sand dunes became much more large, and the sand began to blow. And this was very problematic for a lot of parts of the Outer Cape. And this is what Henry Thoreau recorded when he came. He said, "The old houses are built of the timber of the Cape, but instead of the forest in the midst of which they originally stood, barren heaths with poverty grass for heather now stretch away on every side. So when Thoreau walked through the Cape, he realized that the complete, the lack of trees had really changed the whole sort of face of what Cape Cod looked like very rapidly in a span of from 1600 to 1865. So 250 years completely changed what had been in existence for 12,000 years before that. And here's another picture across the Pamet, and you can see the church steeple in the distance and just a few small clumps of trees everywhere. And then actually this slide is, I don't know, got out of place, sorry about that. And then here we are up at the Highland House cottages. Again, no trees in sight, completely barren landscape, and happened very quickly. The other thing that happened in Truro was in the Outer Cape is that we had Route 6 come across and split the Pamet River in half. And when that occurred, we ended up with two very different ecosystems that previously to that had been one. And the first one is the Upper Pamet, which quickly became freshwater or slightly brackish. So as that happened, the plant communities changed very rapidly because they prefer much different. The freshwater plants are very different than the saltwater plants that happened in the Lower Pamet, which you can see the Lower Pamet is just grasses and marshland and very different from the Upper Pamet. So when that happened, when we had this restriction, this was a rapid change in two ecosystems, well, in one ecosystem of Cape Cod. And we know that Route 6 all the way out to Ballston Beach became a much different ecosystem than it was than previously to that. And we all know what happened going forward as the water broke over, the sea broke over Ballston. Now this water has gone back, and it's the ecosystem is completely changing again. And next time you drive by, if you look, you can see that a lot of the plants have completely died off because their salt water they cannot survive in the salt water. So that plant community is rapidly changing. So what happened is you can see the evolution of Truro and the fact that as people began to leave because there was the lack of good pasture land forced people to move out to the Midwest. And what happened was Truro became, the plants communities began to come back. And you can see through these three images how quickly the woodlands began to develop. And by 1990, much of Truro looks like it does today. It was a lot of oak and pitch pine came back. So within 170 years, that's that right? Yeah, 170 years. What was once completely denuded has now returned to new plant communities. And this is where that oak and pitch pine picture was supposed to be. And that's what we have today with a much of oak and pitch pine and lacking in all of those other hardwoods that were previous to European settlement. And you can see the rapid decline in population in Truro. You can see from people started to really leave in, let's see, with the 1850 and 1860s, a rapid decline of population out of Truro. And then by 1930, you can see that there's an incline again of population. But the rapid decline had a lot to do with the ecosystems of the Outer Cape and how they had been changed, and the lack of how fishing had been impacted as well, and salt making and all of the other things that were taking place on the Outer Cape. And then here's an image. You can see that the plant communities are slowly coming back, and you can see there's still some open space, but the pitch pine and the oak are slowly beginning to fill back in all over Truro. And this has to do with, as new fields or plants begin to colonize, often red cedars come back in, and that's the first plant, but then the pitch pine takes over from that, and so does the oak species. So it's this evolution of how the old farm fields get grown up again going forward. So the other thing that happened was when the Europeans came, they brought a lot of plants with them. And I think people might recognize this as locust. And the reason that locust was brought in, because it grows very rapidly, and because Cape Cod had been denuded so rapidly, it was thought that if they brought in the locust trees, they would grow quickly. And they did. And they have done very well here. And we see a lot of locusts, but they are not native to Cape Cod. There's a black locust, you can see with the great flowers that smell incredible in the spring and bring the Baltimore Orioles to the Cape, but they're not native to Cape Cod. The other thing that everybody thinks is a native Cape Cod plant is Rosa rugosa, beach rose. And this isn't necessarily a bad plant, it's actually a good plant because again, it prevents erosion, but it came here in the ballast of ships, and a lot of plants that became invasive species in New England came in the ballast of ships. And then finally, this gypsy moth, about 3 years ago in Truro in the Outer Cape, and actually all over Massachusetts, there was a massive influx of gypsy moth. And this has directly to do with climate change. Because gypsy moth is an invasive species that was brought here by a man in Medford, actually, but it depends on having drought conditions, because if we have good rains in the spring and fall, there's actually a virus that will kill the gypsy moths. But for 3 years in a row, we had much warmer temperatures in New England and very heavy drought conditions. And these two conditions align for a gypsy moth explosion. And you would be driving down Route 6 and you could see the complete denuding of the native oak trees and even the pitch pine. So when you drive around certain parts of Truro today, you can see very large dead sections of oaks and pitch pine. And this has a lot to do with the influx of gypsy moth. Now, last year we had a very good rainy spring and fall, and the virus that kills the gypsy moths was able to take hold, and they basically died overnight. And so, but it still did a lot of damage, and this very much has to do with climate change. The other one that we see a lot, and here's a picture out at Ballston, is Phragmites, and this is an invasive species, and it takes away from those native cattails and bulrushes that we saw in the earlier images. And this is a very aggressive plant that has taken over a lot of land very quickly. And it can live in salt water or brackish water. So I think that going forward, we're going to see more of this in the upper Pamet. And as you can see where the Ballston Beach broke and the line where the Phragmites starts. And then finally, we talk about Cape Cod is going to be, and has already been, highly influenced by our warming world and the rising seas. And we see that directly at Ballston Beach, where the ocean has broken through many, many times, and where erosion has had a huge impact on the coast of the Cape, and how the plant communities along the edge are being vastly impacted, especially in the wetland areas where they're being inundated with higher, with sea level rise going forward. So this is something that we have to face now. And I know that Lauren has been doing some programming around climate change on Cape Cod. And it has been documented that it is influencing plant communities here and will continue to do so going forward. So I think the more that we understand about what's happening, and the more willing we are going to be to take action in that vein. So I think that's all. And I don't know if anyone has any questions, but I guess we'll find out.
At the moment, we have one question from Helen McNeil Ashton, who would like to know to what extent are vines the product of colonial activity, for example, catbrier, poison ivy, brambles, and others?
Ah, good question. Well, actually, catbrier and poison ivy are both native plants, and they predated colonialism. And the third one is brambles. I don't know what the multiflora rose and is an invasive species, and that was brought here. And then I know honeysuckle was also an invasive species that was brought here. An interesting thing about honeysuckle, I just read an article about flickers and how that there's a man who studies the birds, flickers on Cape Cod, and he noticed that the color of the flickers was changing. And it turns out that the flickers, their diet has changed to much more, they're eating the invasive species, the honeysuckle berries, and it's changing the color of their feathers. And so the question is whether this evolution is going to be okay for the birds, whether it provides the same sort of dietary needs, or it's going to be problematic for the birds. So that's an interesting thing about honeysuckle, which I know we're all trying to get rid of because it's a bad invasive species.
I've got a number of questions coming in from Arlene Miller. Locusts have become quite a problem in my area. What do you see happening as they continue to multiply?
Well, I think it's hard to say because this is the issue about some of the plants that have been brought to Cape Cod and they're doing quite well, like locust, because as climate change becomes more and more problematic and the temperature warms, certain species are going to be better adapted to living here, and they might actually fulfill some niche of some plants that won't be able to survive here. So as far as them taking over, I don't really see a problem with that. And I haven't seen an issue of as long as you cut them down. I guess they do sprout at the base, but as far as them, they do serve in the ecosystem services because they provide a lot of food for birds and bees. So that's something to think about.
From Jim Summers, Debbie, what effect does burning have on seed germination?
So a lot of seeds can survive burning, and we know that pitch pine depends on burning, so to open the seed pods. But what I think has been found out in these recent burns in Cape Cod is that a lot of the plants can survive in the soil. And this is because the fires do not get very hot compared to, say, if you have a fire out in the West where they have these massive forest fires. The idea of these controlled or prescribed burns that Native Americans did, and now that the National Seashore is doing, that they're low temperature fires. So they're not going to kill all the seed in the soil, which is a good thing.
That's good news. From Susan Howe, can you talk a little bit about bearberry?
So bearberry is a native plant, and I know that Native Americans did eat the berries. They're also high in vitamin C, I believe. You might check that before you eat that. But they're also very good because they are a very drought tolerant plant, and they prevent erosion as well and soil degradation. So it's a good native plant on Cape Cod, and a lot of people confuse it with the native cranberries because they look similar, but they're not similar. They're not. They taste very different. Cranberries need a much wetter environment to survive than bearberry, which is very drought tolerant plant.
An anonymous question. Bramble is actually wild blackberry. Just wondered if there were two types.
Yes, I think So that's the thing, is that when we use common name of plants, is that they often can mean a large group of plants. So I know that there's many different kinds of blackberries, and I don't know my Latin for fruit. I know I'm not a fruit person, besides apples and things like that, but there's probably a lot of different ones. And I would say that any that I see on Cape Cod, I've eaten the fruit and it's all delicious. So I'm a proponent for keeping those. They're also great wildlife plants, unless they provide food and shelter for all kinds of wildlife, which is important.
From Pat Rooney, can you discuss the Asiatic bittersweet invasion?
Yes, one of my favorites. So invasive species is kind of my area of specialty, because where I work, we deal with all kinds of invasive species. And the problem with them is that, so there is a native bittersweet, and it's very different. I have only seen it once, but the invasive species is very problematic because it's a vining plant. It's very hard to get rid of because it will sprout from even the tiniest piece of root that's left in the ground. And we know that birds love the fruit, and they spread it very rapidly. So my recommendation for dealing with bittersweet is, and any kind of plant, this has to do with honeysuckle, any kind of plant that fruits, is that you need to cut it down before it produces fruit. Because once it produces fruit, you're spreading that invasive species to a much broader area. So if you can keep it from fruiting, at least you're maintaining that plant in one place. And I don't recommend using chemicals. We don't use any chemicals on any invasive species at my work, with the exception of bittersweet. And that is because it's impossible to get rid of. And I recommend cutting it and painting the stub with glyphosate. And that way you're not spreading the chemical around the area. You're only putting it directly on the plant. And that's the only way you're going to get rid of bittersweet, I'm sorry to say.
Good advice. Okay, from Eileen Paris. In the last several years, she's noticed there's a great effort to plant seagrass in much of the dunes land. Given the weather and strong storms, how is the grass doing?
So that's interesting. I just read an article about the whole project they've done at Herring Cove. And if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend going to look at it, because it's really unbelievable. I think they spent $3 million on the renovation, but they planted all new beach grass, and it'll survive, but it won't hold back these storms that we're going to get. It's just not, it's not capable of doing that. It's a temporary fix. A seawall would be a longer fix, but that's not going to happen either. So the dune grass works, but it's not going to stop. I'm sorry to inform you of this, because it's hard to think about, but it's a temporary stopgap measure at this point.
Is there evidence that the Wampanoags kept bees or used wild honey?
That is a great question. I have not found anything to that. And if anyone has, I would love to hear about that, because I would think probably yes, because people have been collecting honey for thousands and thousands of years. And, but I don't know of any of that to be true or not.
Arlene Miller, where did all this poison ivy come from? Was it introduced?
Yeah, so I mentioned poison ivy is a native plant, and actually I have the only problem with poison ivy, and we all know it, right, is that it makes humans itch, but otherwise it's a great wildlife plant. A lot of birds depend on the fruit, and it doesn't kill anything. It doesn't, it's not like English ivy that will strangle a tree. It will live in a tree, but it won't kill it. So poison ivy is native, and it's a good wildlife plant. So if it's in a place that's not, you're not going or anyone else is going, this is personal preference, I would highly recommend to leave it there. But that's just me, and I'm highly allergic to poison ivy, so.
From Pam Fickner, what are some marker plants for seeing climate change?
Well, I think we're going to see, that's an interesting point. I think, well, I mentioned we have a lot of marker pests, including gypsy moth, winter moth. There's a lot of pests that are more impacted by climate change that we'll see rapid change with. But plants, more poison ivy, yes, that is climate change. It thrives in drought conditions and hot and dry climates. We're going to see less and less, we're going to see the more and more of the invasive species that thrive, and then less and less of our native species, with the exception of poison ivy. So that's what that's what's going to happen. And that's why I mentioned the fact that we need to start looking at some of these invasive species as going forward. They're going to be, they're going to naturalize, and they're going to become more important in our ecosystems. And things like Phragmites as well. We're going to see more and more of that, which is definitely problematic. The one thing about Phragmites is it fixes nitrogen, which is a good thing, but we don't need the nitrogen fixed in the water around Truro. I think it's pretty, the water is pretty healthy, I would think. So.
Susan Kurtzman would like to know, what about grapes? Are they indigenous or not? They seem to be growing everywhere.
Yes, they are indigenous, and I don't know how the Wampanoag, I didn't find any information about how Wampanoag used grapes, but they are native here. I would imagine they ate them, but I don't know. Another plant that will thrive with climate change, they can take very hot, dry conditions and do very well and adapt to that.
Janice Hirsch would like to know, is Virginia rose invasive? And is there a native rose?
There is a native rose. I don't know what you mean by Virginia rose. That's the thing, again, when you use a common name, it's hard to delineate what it is. There's a native rose called swamp rose, and the way you tell it between an invasive multiflora rose, it looks exactly the same, except the flower is pink and not white. So it's a good time because the roses are blooming, and if you want to determine whether you have a native rose or an invasive rose, that's one way to tell. The other thing I will say about multiflora rose, even though I hate it, it's a plant that again, it's a good wildlife plant and a plant for bees, and it thrives in this climate. So that might be another plant that going forward becomes more and more important for eating species.
And what about cactus on the Cape? That crazy cactus.
I know that because I don't know the name of that cactus. It's a prickly pear cactus. I think that's actually a native plant, but I'm not 100% sure about that. And that's because we have this incredibly sandy, dry soil here that it thrives, and it manages somehow to stay alive through the winter. I see it die back a little bit, but it thrives. That and things like sedum that are cactus-like plants. But otherwise, to be honest with you, I don't know a ton about cactus.
Amy Wolf asked, she said she's noticed Scotch broom taking hold on the Cape. Is this being addressed?
Yeah, so Scotch broom is not a native plant, and it can be very aggressive, and I think that's a plant that will take. I mean, it's beautiful and it smells good, but I think going forward as it gets hotter and drier, I think that's another plant that is going to do quite well. I don't know if it's being addressed by towns or not. I'm not sure.
Joanna Salmon would like to know, are there any native grasses?
Oh yes, there's many native grasses. What I would do is, to be honest, I would Google native grasses to Cape Cod. And this is a problem. So the grasses are really going to suffer from the saltwater inundation, because in some of these wetland areas that are around Truro, in Truro, and on the outer Cape, as the sea level rises, these grasses that often they can tolerate salt, but they can't tolerate complete salt inundation over and over again. So these very important wetland species that protect parts of Cape Cod from storm inundation are going to start to suffer because of that. So if you want to plant grasses, I highly recommend lemongrass.
Okay. And here's one final question. This is a good one to end with. How do you make lemonade from sumac?
Oh, so you take the cones, they're called the red part, when they should be, actually I noticed there, if you can find them, and you boil them, and then you add sugar or honey or whatever you want to add and strain them out, and then you add ice. That's how you make that.
All right, so someone will be making a sumac cocktail tonight.
Yeah, it'd be good. And
One last question just came up. Are hydrangea native to the Cape? And if not, when were they introduced? And why do they do so well here?
I don't believe they're native to the Cape. They do well because they love the sandy, dry soil. And to be honest, I don't know when they were introduced. There's probably 300 kinds of hydrangea. And some of them do well, and some of them they don't like the hot, dry conditions here. But we know that the pom-pom hydrangeas or the PGs do very well here, and they love that hot, dry, sandy soil that we have. Acidic, they like the slightly acidic soil too, which is what we have here.
Right. All right. Fabulous questions. Thank you, everyone, for
Thank you.
staying and providing Debbie with a lot of wonderful opportunities to answer great questions. This has been wonderful. Thank you, Debbie. This was wonderful. Thank you. Great talk. And have a wonderful night, and we'll be seeing more of you in the future.
Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate you listening to my talk tonight.